1 Corinthians 7 this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is where we're going to start. Let's pray. Father, thank you that your word is adequate and sufficient for all things. Pray that you'd give to us wisdom this morning, and not just as we think about a particular aspect of life, but in the application and use of that for all things. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse number 25 is where I want to begin this morning. First Corinthians 7:25, and we'll come back to, let's go ahead and read the passage. 1 Corinthians 7:25, now concerning virgins I have no commandment of the Lord. Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress, I say, that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife, seek not a wife. And of course he's talking there about divorce. Verse 28, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. So, we're dealing with some questions, and the question hasn't come specifically along this line, but I've touched on it, and let me just talk about the passage and how I think that it helps us here a little bit, or at least the way that I thought about it. Paul is talking in the entirety of the passage about marriage, and it's a little bit broader than marriage. Because he also talks to those who are enslaved. And he's just kind of talking about the overarching, I would think the overarching umbrella of his conversation are our relationships in this world. Whether they be marital or whether they be social, our relationships and our standing in this world. And in verses 29 through 31, he begins to make a series of observations, and I want to make sure that we understand it that way. He's not issuing commands. He's making a series of observations to encourage us to think properly about our life in this world. Right? There is a time coming, verse number 29. The time is short. And, right, I mean, this is the typical way that the Bible talks about in the New Testament, the drawing near of the end of the age. That the time is short, that the end of things are rapidly approaching. Now, we tend to look at our lives as being rather lengthy and, having a lot of different components to them. But in the overall framework of the Bible, right, we are in just about the last, we're in the last days, there's no doubt about that. Right? And then things are going to transition out of that, and so for that reason the time is short. And then what is coming is characterized by the way that Paul goes on to talk from there. It remaineth, right? The time is short, but so here's what's coming, that they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, And they that use this world, and here I want to translate it because I'm not really being critical of abusing, but what does he mean? They that use this world as not using it down. As not, right? As not completely consuming it. So don't cling too tightly, right? Don't live as if this present situation is the be-all and end-all of our existence, whether it be our marital relationships, whether it be our social relationships, whether it be our joys, whether it be our sorrows, whether it be our possessions. We as believers are to live with a view to the fact that there is an age beyond this one. And that's what he argues in verse number 31, for the fashion of this world passeth away. And the word fashion is actually the Greek word that gives us the English word scheme, which was one of those words that just had a tremendous amount of nuance to the Greek ear. Here are some of the ways that it was found translated from Greek in secular writings: attitude, character, conformation, demeanor, deportment, display, glory, magnificence, manner, posture, shape. So as people have taken Greek writings and translated them into English, this is the way that they have dealt with that word schema, the scheme. So there is coming a day when those who are borrowing from the world will not bear the world down. And this reflects, I think, then one of the reasons I thought about this passage, I thought about that word as not abusing it. It is actually the same, if I can just go back to the grammar for a second, it's right, you have the word using, and then literally the word abusing is that same Greek word using added to it, down. Using down. This is part and parcel of the way that we should address anything that we would wonder about being worldly. Worldliness has to, at some level, folks, be some portion of being worldly has to be a reflection of the value that we place upon that particular thing. I mean, everybody has, for instance, a car. But Christians should value their modes of transportation differently than other people do, because we should understand intuitively at all times that there is more to life than the things that we possess right now. We should also think about our sorrows. Paul mentions them specifically here. We should think about our sorrows differently, because even if our earthly life right now is characterized by more sorrow than we would ever want, it is not the be-all and end-all of our human existence. That's the gist there. And I just thought about that concept when I thought about the subject matter that I wanted to address this morning, which is social media. And again, I'm dealing with some questions, and I've not really had a question specifically, what about social media? We have conversations about it. The question actually came, what if I'm aware of somebody's sinfulness through their use of social media? What do I do then? So I thought that perhaps we might find some benefit to just turn our attention to social media this morning, or my views on social media. And my intention is to do what I usually do, is just, I've got one Sunday's material on it, and then if there's conversation, question, feedback, then I'm certainly willing to expand on that. So, right, so social media. What about social media in general? Well, what about social media in general? So here would be my take. Social media is simply one in the latest of a very long line of means of communication. In other words, as I've thought about it and tried to wrestle through this and answer some of the questions, I would encourage us not to think radically differently about social media, which tends to be the way that some of us do. There have been books for a long, long time. There have been personal letters for a long, long time. We are communicators by nature. We are verbal by creation. We talk to each other. We talk about things. We talk about each other. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that in and of itself is not bad. In the research that I've done, the oldest recognized newspapers came along in the early 17th century, the early 1600s. Both Strasbourg, which is today France, but has been France and French and German over the course of its history, had its first newspaper in 1609. The Dutch, who were some of the earliest world traders and had a very extensive network of trading posts and colonies, were the first people who gave us anything that resembled international news coverage. And when newspapers started to be printed, then immediately they ran into opposition. Much of that opposition came in the form of the opposition of centralized authorities like the government and the church. For instance, we know that Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, which revolutionized the world. The Roman Catholic Church was a big fan of the movable type printing press and used it extensively because they were trying to achieve a way to have their edicts unaltered. Right? The Pope would issue an edict, or the Vatican would issue an edict, and then people would be taken to copying them by hand. And, some guy'd read it and he'd go, well, that ain't right. I'm going to fix that, or I don't like that, so I'm going to change that. And so they would just be disseminated in a variety of forms. And the church said, we got to put an end to this. So printing them helped them to do that. So when printed forms of communication came like that, right? And I'm really trying to go somewhere with this, folks, right? In fact, we're living in a place, I'm not going to ask the question because it would show our age, and I'm not trying to insult anybody, but we have a whole generation of young people now who have virtually no connection whatsoever to a newspaper. Who in the world in their right mind would buy and read a newspaper? But for many years, newspapers were the primary form of public communication, and when they came out with some level of controversy. And so authorities began to react to the content of newspapers. England developed a concept that is known as prior restraint, that the British government kept to itself the right to prevent newspapers from publishing things. Yeah, you can't say that. You can't print it unless we give you permission to that. And prior restraint was a big part of what drove the logic of the First Amendment, freedom of the press. You can print anything that you want. Which was a great idea, folks. We put it into the blessed Constitution. But John Adams, who was the president from 1796 to 1800, signed into law what are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which the government used to shut down newspapers that were favorable of Thomas Jefferson's view. And they used that power to put over 20 newspaper editors in prison because of what they published. Freedom of the speech, freedom of the press. Say whatever you'd like to say. So we've had mass forms of that. As these things came out, they were on the one hand very popular, and they were on the other hand very scandalous. Because people are going to publish things that not everybody is going to agree with. And again, if you go back into the critical period or the early American history, right? There was no pretense of reporting being unbiased. Newspapers were Federalist or they were Republican, and cities had multiple papers, and they made their views plain, and they were clearly lined up on one side or the other. It was in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, but it wasn't until 1920 people began playing with radio waves. But in 1920, and all the kids who ever go through the Abeka curriculum should have this etched into their memories. In 1920, the first commercial radio station went on the air, KDKA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We had the first radio broadcasts. The first time that a radio station was endeavoring to make money through its programming. We're going to broadcast shows. We're going to pursue advertisers. We're going to charge fees. We're going to try and turn these magical airwaves into something that we can make money with. And in 1927, the U.S. Congress passed the Radio Act of 1927, which created the Federal Radio Commission, which became the FCC in 1934, the Federal Communications Commission, which had some role of censorship. Hey, there are things you can't say on a radio program. And there are positions you can't take on a radio program. But again, folks, it's a mass form of communication. It's out there. It is available for everybody to have and to use. And again, you can just imagine that because of that, it is not going to be without its controversies. And invariably, those who are living in the advent of that age, right? Benjamin Franklin probably never wrote an article, never gave much thought, for all of his brilliance, about the implications of a radio program. You can just imagine, folks, what it must have been like in church services across the country when radio really began to get traction. You can imagine that pastors preach sermons against spending too much time listening to the radio. And I saw some documentary some years ago, and I want to say that it was Pat Boone, but don't quote me on that, who said that you could literally walk down the sidewalk and everybody had their radio to the same radio program. You could walk down the sidewalk in his street and you could listen to the entire broadcast because every house was playing it. So you can imagine, folks, that sermons went, don't spend too much time listening to the radio. And radio is going to corrupt the morals of the country. And radio is going to present an erroneous picture of what it means to be an American. Movies as commercial enterprises emerge about the same time. In 1915, D.W. Griffith produced, directed, and published Birth of a Nation, a 3+ hour long silent film. You can get it on YouTube. It'll be the longest 27 hours of your life. The movie was considered incredibly racist even in its day. It gave rise to a renewed Ku Klux Klan movement in the South. It was a Civil War era, very demeaning of black people in its depiction of them. Even in 1915, it was considered a highly racist movie. And it actually was banned in some cities. And D.W. Griffith went on to campaign for freedom of speech, right? We have freedom of speech. We can say what we want to say, and we can put it out in the public airwaves. When I was a student at UNO, one of the professors that I had actually taught a class on movie censorship. I never took the class. I would have, I just never had an opportunity to take it. But he would talk periodically about the impact of movie censorship in the United States of America. Studios would produce films and they would distribute. And in those days, it was all done through actual, reels, where the reels had to be distributed. And those reels would be sent to theaters and cities, and local governments would view them to decide if they were suitable to show in their cities. And then they would send reports back and make requests to the studio to alter this or to alter that. And the studios very quickly found themselves overwhelmed with trying to produce one movie in 25 or 30 components, and they ultimately took to themselves the idea of rating movies. And the Roman Catholic Church, very astutely, remember folks, in the early 20th century, Roman Catholicism was not only a religious minority, it was a very unpopular religious minority. Roman Catholicism very astutely volunteered to have a part in that process of editing movies and presenting them in a way that were acceptable, which is one of the reasons, if you watch very old movies, even though that was the minority unpopular religion, almost all of the religious figures are Roman Catholic. And always the most upstanding and outstanding of citizens. That's not an accident. But again, when movies came, right, when movies came, they were a public form of mass communication that revolutionized the world and therefore upset very many people. Don't go to movies. John R. Rice, who died in 1981, just over 40 years ago, I mean, we're not talking somebody from the Middle Ages, said Christians shouldn't see movies because they shouldn't watch unmarried people kiss. Boy, try pushing that rock up a hill today. Try pushing that rock up a hill today. And television arrives then a little bit after that. In 1936, there were 2,000 television sets in use worldwide. In 2019, there were 1.7 billion households that paid for some type of television service. 1.7 billion that are paying for some type of television service. When I became a pastor, right, almost all of the television controversy was whether or not somebody paid for cable. It was okay to have TV if it wasn't cable, but it was sinful to pay money for cable TV. And that was kind of the way the fight went. Once again, that fight is long gone and over. And here's the point, again, right? I'm trying to make what I think is a legitimate point here, right? We talk about social media, and we kind of look at social media as if this is something new and novel. And there are some novel features to it. I'm not arguing against that. But let's not lose sight of what it really is, folks. It is one more in a long line of mass forms of public communication that Christians and the world at large have had to contend with. That has both a positive side and a negative side. That can be used, and if I can take some liberty with Paul, that can be used and can also be abused. Newspapers can provide a valuable service. They can provide a corrupted service. Radio broadcasting can do a good thing. Radio broadcasting can do a bad thing. Film, rolling movies and television into one can provide a positive service, and it can provide a negative service. And now we are living in the digital age, the age of social media. And if it were not for the internet, folks, the social media platforms would be nothing. I mean, they are a consequence of the internet technology that we have. Now, I would argue that there are some differences, and the differences are critical. Prior to the internet, when we talked about these issues, right, when a pastor went to the pulpit, whether he was talking about newspaper in his day, or radio, or movies, or television, he was primarily talking to people whose almost always only single role was to be a consumer. Are you going to read the newspaper or not? Are you going to listen to the radio or not? Are you going to go to the movie theater or not? Are you going to watch the television or not? Because we were simply consumers of the material that was out there. And so that tended to be the way that we viewed it, and that tended to be the way that we talked about defense mechanisms, right? You can't see a bad movie if you never go to a movie theater. Movie theaters are like pool halls. Christians don't belong there, so don't go. And one of our critics a number of years ago said that a fundamentalist was simply a man who would watch on television something he wouldn't go see in a movie theater. Which unfortunately was probably more true than we would want to admit. But here's where social media. So I would argue on the one hand, folks, that social media is really, it really is, in many ways, it is simply one more permutation of mass public communication that everybody in the world has to contend with. Here is where it is relatively revolutionary. For the very first time, we are not simply consumers. For the very first time, we are actually producers. Social media gives everybody with a social media account the ability to be a producer of the content that they disseminate. That is a bit of a game changer. That is, I think, a bit of a game changer. Now, furthermore, it is revolutionary because of the many outlets that we have to consume it or to produce on it. I mean, again, folks, we could just go back, right? Let's just go back to the earliest days of newspapers. Right? I could stand in the pulpit and say, don't subscribe. Don't subscribe to the newspaper. Or I could say, don't turn on a radio. Or a pastor could say, don't go to a movie theater. Or a pastor could say, don't own a television. But now we have personal computers, and of course you know that in 1984 the head of IBM absolutely ridiculed the idea that every home would have a computer. And now we have portable computers, and we have tablets, and we have cell phones. And if you're like me, one of your greatest frustrations with modern technology is that people have stopped driving their cars so they can consume content on their phone. So that it seems to me the city of Omaha, which, by the way, is a Native American word meaning many red lights, should, either that or lane close to head, it depends on which language you're using. It seems to me that our traffic engineers should now build in some cell phone lapse time when a light changes. Add 10 or 15 seconds before the next transition so that people can get done with their phones and look up to see what the traffic light is doing. And the reality is that the proliferation of all of these things have just made something that fundamentally is not new. Right? Fundamentally, this is not new. Mass communication. But now, almost everybody has a cell phone, and certainly everybody under the age of 40 has one. Everybody has one. Which means that everybody has the ability to be both a consumer and a producer right there in the palm of their hand. I would just point out, folks, if I could, that the ability to manage this through a lot of external rules is absolutely impossible. Not that you shouldn't impose rules on your children, but simply to think that we can issue a few edicts and we're going to resolve this, like don't go to movie theaters. That's just never going to happen. So again, I think it's a very old, on one hand, it is mass communication, but it is relatively revolutionary on the other hand in that it is incredibly portable, and now every individual has the ability to be a producer. And look, folks, this has really served in many ways to, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, to democratize the world. That every opinion that is out there is viewed by the vast majority of people to be equally valid. Anyway, that's a whole other subject. So I went to my favorite bookstore, Amazon.com, speaking of the internet. Went to the search bar, clicked books, went to the search bar, and typed in social media. 70,000 entries popped up. 70,000. I didn't study the list exhaustively. I didn't even try. But of the couple of pages of books that I did surf through, it seemed to me that they fell into primarily one of two categories. Category number one is how to make money with social media. How do you make money with social media? How do you use Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and generate income? This is, by the way, the 21st century equivalent to becoming a movie star or a famous athlete. And I've told you this a number of times, but I've worked a couple of elections now with a young man who is a middle school teacher for Millard Public Schools, and I asked him one time about social media in Millard middle schools. And I asked him, do a lot of the young kids want to be influencers? He said, oh, it's unbelievable. That's what they want. And seriously, I'm not trying to be, I'm assuming that everybody knows this, but if you're just so far out of this loop, right? This is a way to fame and fortune, to be a social media influencer. To put on some kind of demonstration, some kind of show, and it can be just something that is truly helpful, or it can be something that is truly vile. And people watch you, and you attract a lot of followers, and followers equal money, because followers equal advertising dollars, and you can make millions of dollars. If you can become a bona fide influencer on social media, you will do very well for yourself financially by generating content, because anybody can be a producer. So one category, again, and there's 70,000 books. There's no way I was going to even look at the list of 70,000 books. But of the immediate results that came up, this tended to be big category number one. How you can generate income from social media. I don't even want to talk about that. Second category, number two, that seemed to be the major category was the ways in which social media is manipulating you, the viewer, and treating you as the product. Or basically how social media is detrimental to you. How you are being taken advantage of through the extensive algorithms. And again, if you traffic in that world, you know that. You cannot, and this is not even really a social media thing, but you cannot go to Google and type into the search bar, new car, without virtually everything that you do on the internet for the next 3 months to be an ad for a new car. I do want to talk a little bit about that. Now, let's just talk a little bit about that biblically. Go back, if you would, to Matthew chapter 15. All right, after a really long introduction and a really big porch. But again, I really think, to set the context, there's a sense, folks, in which when we talk about social media, we're not really talking about anything new. We're talking about a new dimension to something that is very old, which is mass communication. There are new variables, and we ignore them at our own peril. But it is not fundamentally new. People have been communicating a message to other people in a variety of ways about as long as men have been around. All right, so let's just talk about how social media is manipulating you. And I don't really want to get into that road as much as I just want to deal with it from this biblical perspective, folks. Nobody consumes anything without being affected by it. Nobody consumes anything without being impacted by it. In Matthew 15, and we're just going to kind of survey this. Verse number 1, then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees, which were of Jerusalem, saying, why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread? And this is a ritualistic washing, right? We're not having a conversation about sanitation. We're having a conversation about spiritual sanitation, not physical. They're not worried about germs. You're defiling yourself religiously by not washing your hands ritually. Right? Jesus goes on to rebuke them for that. Verse number 10, he called the multitude and said unto them, hear and understand, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. And so we're going to talk, Jesus now wants to talk about being defiled. And the Pharisees were all about defilement through food. And Jesus goes, okay, let's talk about defilement. What you eat doesn't defile you. And it doesn't, folks. And Paul was very adamant about that in his own life, Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. That what we eat does not defile us. Whether or not what we eat is particularly healthy is perhaps another conversation, but nothing that you eat is religiously defiling. Nothing that you eat is sinful because you ate it. Verse number 12, then came his disciples and said to him, knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? Yes, Jesus tipped over their cart. And he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. I'm going to tear up, I'm going to overturn more carts than the Pharisees. Verse number 15, then Peter answered Peter and said unto him, declare unto us this parable. And Jesus said, are ye also yet without understanding? Do not ye yet understand that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goeth into the belly and is cast out into the draught? We eat it, we digest it, we expel it, and that's the end of it. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashen hands defileth not a man. Now, Jesus doesn't say it in so many words here, folks, but we could build the case from a variety of other texts, right? Nothing that I put into my mouth defiles me, but the things that come out of my mouth defile me. And the things that come out of my mouth that defile me are frequently impacted by the things that went into my eyes and into my ears. Or as Paul told the Philippians in Philippians 4:8, here are the things that I want you to think about. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Why? Because what I fill my mind with, what I fill my heart with, does impact me. So that if I spend my life consuming internet content, I cannot do that without being impacted. Just like I could not spend my life reading newspaper accounts. Particularly if I only read, and I'm not arguing for a balance of righteousness and sinfulness, but if all of the newspaper accounts that I would read were slanted one way, then I am going to talk and be impacted in that way and in no other way. All right, so what about social media? Well, okay, this should be fundamental, folks. We shouldn't sit up nights and agonize and wonder about this. Nothing that goes into our mind neutrally. Everything impacts us. That was true before the internet. That is true after the internet. That is true whatever the next generation, 100 years from now, Christianity will be contending with. Perhaps, seriously, folks, perhaps the Lord will delay His return long enough and things will progress enough that in 100 years some man will be standing in a pulpit just like I am, talking about the good old days when all we had to deal with was Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. We just don't know. But what we do know is this. Nobody consumes content of any kind without being impacted by it. Not just positive, but negative. Why should we be faithful and regular in reading of the Scriptures? Because nothing that we consume is neutral. Why should we fill our minds with good things instead of bad things? Because nothing is neutral. So that fundamental principle just comes, folks, whatever is going on in any culture at any time, whether it be newspaper or radio or television or movies or the internet, right? That doesn't change. That doesn't change. So to that extent, social media does not exist as a separate category of being. What you watch, what you hear, the quantity in which you watch and hear it, the appetite that you cultivate for it, of course that's going to impact you. It's going to impact me. How can it not? How can it not? But then, and again, I did not search the entire list of 70,000 books and don't know that would have provided anything at all. Because there is this unique feature to social media that we are also producers of content, right? That is another thing that we have to consider. That is another thing that we do have to consider. And when I'm talking about producing content, I'm talking about anything that we post, any place that we post it. Whether we link over from somebody else's article, whether we post a family picture, whether we post a picture of ourselves, whether we post a picture of our friends. Turn, if you would, to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And once again, folks, this is something that is going to be absolutely true completely and totally independently of social media. Social media is not going to have any impact on this. Every single person answers for what they do. Every person answers for what they do. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 15. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers, and he's talking there about Satan, if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness. Right? So Satan comes in the guise of righteousness. Here is the end, whose end shall be according to their works. Now that's a pretty consistent Bible theme. Revelation 2:23, I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. Revelation 20, verse number 12, I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. The books were open. Another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every man according to their works. So let's go back to the original question. So what do I do if I'm consuming social media and I see a post of another Christian and their social media post is in some way sinful? Every man is responsible for what he does. Now, a whole other separate category that we'll consider is what our proper response is to the sin of a brother, and we basically have three options. But everybody is responsible for what they do. And the content that you create on social media is no different from any other speech you might utter. It is, look, folks, we're not simply going to answer to the Lord for what we do. Paul is very clear that we as Christians are going to answer for the intents of our heart. What was our secret agenda? And the Lord is, as he is described in the book of Acts, the heart knower. The heart knower. So to all of us, right? Look, some folks just take the approach, I want nothing to do with social media. I can't fault that. I would just take the position, folks, that like television and movies and radio and newspapers, it is not going to go away. And the longer it goes, the more mainstream it will become. And the longer it goes, the less controversial it will be. But we also understand this, folks, the more we push and expand those kinds of things, right? The fewer barriers there are to the type of content that is produced. So that even when we talk about things like censorship from authorities and government entities, that has backed away considerably. Always to the same impulses, folks, right? Always to the same impulses, to the pressures of society to advance in its sinfulness. And social media is not going to be exempt from that. Right? But I would just say in general, to those of you that are my age, all the way down to the youngest of you who's producing any kind of social media content, you answer for what you produce. You're responsible for what you produce. And I would just make the argument that accountability, if you will, exists on at least three levels. Okay, first of all, folks, and we all know this probably in an unfavorable sense, but the platforms themselves censor. The platforms themselves have some form of censorship. So you can look at Facebook and you can find that there are things that it won't post or that it calls misinformation because the platforms themselves censor content. And again, we're probably not happy with, right? We would like them to censor it in one way, not another, but content can be censored. And there are things that you cannot put on Facebook, and there are pictures and things that you cannot put on Instagram. I'm assuming, I'm not a huge consumer of any of these, but I'm assuming that every platform has some level of censorship. Things you can and cannot say. Certainly, folks, we are answerable to God for the things that we post. We do not post them in neutrality. And for anybody, young or old, to think that they can post a picture or make a statement or make an argument and put it out there on one of the media sites and that they have washed their hands of any responsibility or accountability for what they've done, that is absolute folly. So, right. And by the way, so let me just incorporate my third one here, and I'll be done. We are absolutely accountable to God. I am accountable to God for everything that I say on Facebook or any article that I link to, for the position that it takes, because I'm accountable to God for what I do in every deed. So, and by the way, social media is not the first place to do this, folks. We do this with television all the time. We think somehow that we are insulated from the sinfulness of something by being an observer of it rather than an actor in it. That somehow we're less connected. It's there on the TV, and I wouldn't let my wife or my husband or my children use that kind of language, but it's on television. It's somehow different. We've insulated ourselves, and we tend to insulate ourselves when it comes to social media. I put that out there, but that's not really me. But it is really you, and it is really me. And the third place, folks, that we have some dimension of answerability is by those who are consumers of our content. Right? Many people, I hope no one in our kind of world, but many people post things specifically in the hopes that it will generate a lot of attraction and lots of likes and favorable responses. So the things, and by the way, I would just point this out, right? If the kind of thing you're willing to post to get the favor of godless, evil people, right, that says something very seriously wrong about the way you think spiritually. Again, folks, our posts are a reflection of us. I worked on this Sunday school lesson. I put it together. I finished it. I saved it. I printed it. I put it away. And an hour later, I got an email from a friend of mine that was making reference to this. This was something that a pastor in Ogden, Utah posted on Twitter. Now, he's not He's not what we would be. He's a very conservative man, but he would be more in the Presbyterian mold. He's a younger man. He's got 5 children. And this is what he posted on Twitter. Let me just read you the post. You can find it. His name is Brian Sauve, Sauve. Ladies, dear ladies, there is no reason whatsoever for you to post pictures of yourself in low-cut shirts, bikinis, bra and underwear, or anything similar ever. Not to show your weight loss journey, not to show your newborn baby, not to document your birth story, your brother's. 20 million people have seen that Twitter. Many of them professing Christians, many of them who have excoriated this man for that post, for the audacity of suggesting that women don't belong exposed on the internet. If you post content, people are going to see it. If the reaction to your posting is unfavorable, that is a price you pay for posting social media content. You don't get to pick. You just don't get to pick. And by the way, look, I'm so far removed from the workforce, I don't even know how to describe it, but in my efforts to keep up with it, here's one of the things I understand that prospective employers do. Look at your social media. What do you say? What are you doing? You want to work here? Let me have access to your social media pages. So, right, the notion, folks, that we can just post things and there's no consequence to that just, you just got to understand that it's just not going to be like that. You're going to answer to God for what you post, just like I am, and what you post is going to be interacted with on behalf by other people. And if you post something inappropriate and you get called out by the Christian community on that, that's not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. Okay, I got 7 minutes until 11 o'clock. If you have questions, comments, because I just didn't even try to answer all the potential questions, but I'm happy to hear from you privately. You can reach me on Facebook.